you have to apoyar, you have to support your local farmers around your neighbors, your neighborhoods, the people close to you who are producing food in a sustainable way. And I think the movie is a great way of having that conversation, because if there's a theme in the movie, which is what are the material conditions for the next generation of farmers to be able to farm. That's happening in the whole world. It's not only something that's happening in Puerto Rico. It's happening in the global farming community.
Welcome to the 309th installment of Ear to the Ground, the Land Stewardship Project's podcast on family farming, regenerative agriculture, community food systems, and local democracy. I'm Elizabeth McCarowitz, Membership Support Specialist at the Land Stewardship Project. Land access is a common struggle for emerging farmers globally. New generations of farmers want to farm in sustainable, regenerative ways and provide food for their families and communities, but struggle to find land and a path to sustainable income. On June 3rd and 4th, 2023, there will be an opportunity to learn more about how farmers in Puerto Rico are working to meet this challenge during a pair of LSP screenings of the documentary Stewards of the Land, or Serán las Dueñas de la Tierra, by Puerto Rican filmmakers Marioga Reyes Cruz and Juan Manuel Pagan Teitelbaum. The June 3rd screening will be in Northfield, Minnesota, and on June 4th, the film will be shown in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in partnership with Copal, Minnesota, Sharing Our Roots, and Commons Land. This film follows the stories of 3 beginning farmers in Puerto Rico as they build relationships and find creative ways to access land to grow food for their communities. Those familiar with LSP's farm beginnings and land access programs will see many similarities between the challenges faced by these 3 farmers featured in Stewards of the Land and the types of barriers LSP members and organizers are working to break down. These young farmers are idealistic and care deeply about finding meaningful work that will benefit their communities and address the challenges of a rapidly changing climate. Of course, a key difference is that Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States and lacks the same rights and privileges of those of us with statehood. In early May, I, along with Ryan Perez, who is the policy director of Copal, Minnesota, as well as a former LSP staffer, joined a Zoom call with the producers of Stewards of the Land for a nuanced discussion of the themes their documentary brings to the fore. In the following conversation, you'll learn more about the shared struggles and strategies of beginning farmers in Puerto Rico and how we can build solidarity for a food and farming system that creates health and wealth for both people and the planet.
My name is Juan Manuel Pagan Teitelbaum. I'm a Puerto Rican filmmaker that lives in Puerto Rico, and I used to be a farmer. I've been farming on and off throughout my life. I studied filmmaking in college here in Puerto Rico. And when I was around 28 years old, I moved to a farm of my family where I started farming up in the mountains of Utuado. And at that time, I met Marioga Reyes Cruz, who's my partner in life and in our projects. While I was living up there in the mountains doing farming, I started filming my neighbor farmers, people who I was learning from. I started doing short documentaries about their work. And that's how we started documenting for the last decade the movement of sustainable agriculture in Puerto Rico. It started, kind of like doing it as a personal project, and then it converted into a series that we did with the Department of Agriculture of the United States and Puerto Rico, where we made like 10 short documentaries about sustainable farming in Puerto Rico, trying to showcase what was possible, trying to put a face on the new generation of farmers, which had, different ages, young, old. It was our first project that started documenting this movement, and we were worried that we weren't showing the struggles or the challenges of farming, not only in this capitalist society, but with the climate crisis. And that's how we decided to do this movie, Stewards of the Land, Serán las Dueñas de la Tierra.
Hi, saludos to everybody. I'm Maria Olga Reyes Cruz. I am a community psychologist and ethnographer by training. And I've been in relationship with Wama Pan, Taitelbaum for over 10 years. And one of the many projects that we've done together, and perhaps the one that has sort of move us to where we're at right now, the current project that I'll speak about later, is documenting the agroecological movement in Puerto Rico, in part because we recognize the importance of farming to carve sovereignty in Puerto Rico, and also because we started seeing the need to sort of draw a different imaginary of what could be and what life could be in Puerto Rico. That's more self. Ay, Dios mío, the thing that how we can carve a life in Puerto Rico that is sustainable, that makes us happy, that is guided by other kinds of relationships with nature and our communities, that are sort of opening spaces for a post-capitalist life. We had this sort of when we met, I was actually involved in education organizing as a non-tenure faculty at the public university in Puerto Rico, and Wama was very active in the agroecological movement. And when we got together, we basically recognized that what he was doing at a very small scale needed to be broadened so that we could amplify and democratize the discussion about food sovereignty and also the climate crisis in Puerto Rico. So this process led us to first say, well, let's show what we can do and what is done, against all the narrative that farming is not sustainable and we depend on imports. Puerto Rico imports 85% of its food. And then, like Wama said, we also know that we had to show the struggles. So that's how Será las Dueñas de la Tierra came about, which is a documentary, a feature-length documentary, where we follow the lives of three young farmers who are committed to agroecology. And we started filming when they were entering for the first time to these farms that had been in a natural state for many decades. And we follow their day-to-day struggles for 3 years, starting in 2016, and the last scenes we filmed in 2020, actually.
Can we go back a little bit to what you were saying about democratizing the conversation around food sovereignty? What do you mean by that?
Well, in Puerto Rico, like in many places where the green, quote unquote, green revolution took hold and industrialization of farming took hold. In Puerto Rico, when people talk about farming, they talk about agribusiness, right? And so the conversation is very rarely about what we need and how to do it sustainably and in a way that makes sense for farmers and for consumers. And it goes to the issues of how to make sure that you have a successful business. That's sort of the dominant narrative, right? And when I met Wama and he was already engaged with Organización Boricua de Agricultura Ecológica, which is the oldest organization in Puerto Rico that groups agroecological farmers, the conversations there were very different. They were about where to get seeds, how to learn from each other, how to farm differently with nature, how to sustain their labor, and also trying to find markets for their harvest in a way that could also sustain communities that don't necessarily have access to. But these conversations were being had within the movement, right? Most people didn't really understand much about agroecology or how it was done and what can be done. So that's why we started filming for other audiences, right? So we wanted, in a way, to amplify and make it as popular as possible, right? Mainstream as possible.
Mhm.
The conversation, the practices, how it looks, how it feels, and so the short series help us do that because they were also in a format that went to internet. It was word to mouth. People could use it in different spaces to have conversations. And we try to do the same thing with the documentary, in the way that, well, in a way, because the documentary had to be shown in commercial theaters, we did it in a way that, to try to ensure that it would be shown across the archipelago, and that people who normally wouldn't even think about agriculture would be interested and would bring other people to see it.
I wanted to ask a question of you, Mariolga, about like your training as an ethnographer. And you said psychology as well. Has any part of that training been useful in like the evaluation of these projects? Or like, how can you sort of, not that we have to put a measure on everything, like I try to resist that, but like, what have the results been of your project, and how has your background been useful in kind of looking at those?
Yeah, well, I think that for me as a community psychologist and ethnographer, it was very natural to understand the documentary medium, and also to produce for documentaries. So the ideas about, how just to observe, follow, make questions, try to show rather than tell the story. Of course, I love writing, and I write, but it's different to tell, and many documentaries that people are used to seeing, they tell you what's going on, right? You have experts telling you what the situation is and so on. One of the things that characterize our work from the get-go is try to show the process, try to show what it feels to be at a farm, to steward the land, right? To try to make the best of a process. So for me, it was almost natural to move to that medium. Of course, ethnographers want to document more that you can actually document in a documentary, right? Because what do you do with hours and hours and hours and hours of film when you want to create a series that's 10 minutes, every episode, or an hour and a half. So there is something about also shaping that story, which is always there, right? It's not like we're showing it as it happened. We're also carving the story from what we are seeing. So that was, for me, it's been like perfect in that sense. Also because academic work could be very closed, right? Very siloed. And as a public intellectual, for me, it's more important to have the public conversations. Mm-hmm. And to do it with documentaries is perfect, because we have seen how people just connect, not only rationally, but emotionally, to stories that also speak to their own lives. And that's a very different place from where to have a conversation, rather than saying what we believe politically or ethically, right? Connecting from experience to then talk about the politics and then talk about the ethics. It's a different place to have the conversation. So we haven't proposed to ourselves to do any kind of systematic evaluation like you were asking. But what we have also seen, observed, is people's reaction to what we do, right? And Wama keeps tracks about, for example, how many people have seen the short documentaries in YouTube through the years. The public television continues to broadcast them as a series that is more than 10 years old, and people still like comment on it. And with the documentary, it was, I mean, frankly, we thought that it was going to go to the theaters for 1 or 2 weeks, and then we were off the, off the road with the film forums, but that's not what happened. It stayed in theaters for 10 weeks. People took upon themselves to get everybody to see it. People would go more than once, bring their parents, bring their friends. They took the campaign on their own. They posted themselves in front of the posters and with the tickets, and it took its a life on its own. And we already had plans for a social impact campaign, to do film forums and so on. So it caught us like sort of in the middle of that. And people started asking to bring the documentary to community centers, public plazas, public schools, private schools, everywhere. And Wama has done many presentations.
30 already.
Over 30 presentations. That's besides the film festival circuit. And we still get invited to bring the documentary and we when we can, as if we can. And I think it's most of the presentations we've been able to bring the farmers, or at least one of the farmers, to have the conversation, because it's not just to see it, it's to talk about it. And that goes back to democratizing the conversation, to take it out of the small circles that are trying to take root, but also to the public who ultimately can support them and support the policies that support the farmers.
And in our tours around the United States, especially we've only been on the East Coast and Chicago recently. There was always an ask of the public how they could help the farmers in Puerto Rico. And we would always say, that's great. I mean, we do need help. I mean, one way of helping is changing local politics of the United States, which would have an impact in the whole world. But the other way is that you have to apoyar, you have to support your local farmers around your neighbors, your neighborhoods, the people close to you who are producing food in a sustainable way. And I think the movie is a great way of having that conversation, because if there's a theme in the movie, which is what are the material conditions for the next generation of farmers to be able to farm, that's happening in the whole world. It's not only something that's happening in Puerto Rico, it's happening in the global farming community.
There's a group of BIPOC farmers in Minnesota that has come together to create this sort of intersectional term to define themselves. And so they call themselves emerging farmers. And emerging is different from beginning. It's meant to encapsulate some more pieces. So it refers to something that is starting to exist, or something which is just beginning to be noticed. In this regard, emerging farmers encompasses both those individuals who are entirely new to farming, as well as those individuals who've been farming for generations, but were outside of the scope of traditional state and federal agricultural support programs. And that was actually pulled from our Minnesota Department of Agriculture's website. Like they've adopted the term and are talking about emerging farmers as this like different category here in the state, and developing policies using that definition. So I think your film is really going to resonate with that group of farmers here in Minnesota, these emerging farmers whose primary barrier to pursuing a career in agriculture is land access. That's global. What do you think about that categorization that I just described? Is it new to you? Do you see any similarities to the farmers that you featured in the film? And like, how is it different from the farmers that you work with?
I would say that most of the protagonists in our film are were emerging farmers when we started filming. I mean, Jan Pagan had been farming for 10 years in his house where he grew up. Like he had a garden for 10 years. He was producing food for his family in a small farmers market before he started farming in this 69-acre farm. Alfredo also was a farmer who practiced farming with his family and grandfather for decades. So these are farmers who had already contact with farming in a smaller scale. And Stephanie comes from a farming family. They had a coffee plantation, and she did help with all the work there when she was little. Yeah, there is they are. I mean, the film does depict emerging farmers. That's a term I didn't know, or I didn't coin that way. So I'm glad to hear about it.
I think in Latin America, they're also reconceptualizing and rethinking some of these concepts to try to reflect what has happened in the last 500 years, and also what is happening with the people who are reclaiming farming as a dignified and necessary. Okay, just so let me see. Just to recap, what we've been observing is that there is a resignification of agriculture, and recognition of the long 500 years of exploitation, right? Because part of it is under what conditions people are able to produce food. And so some of the terms that we've heard is neojíbaro, which is sort of new peasant, and also recampesinar.
Can you repeat the first term?
Neojíbaro.
Neojíbaro
is the peasant, the Puerto Rican peasant. Also, neorurales has been a term that I've heard to mark that there are people who are turning away from cities or from that notion of progress or development, quote unquote, and sort of reclaiming the rural life. And also the idea of recampesinar, which is to strengthen the peasantry or become peasants again, or recognize that life. There's sort of the conversations here, because
and just to add some clarity, in English that word peasant can have negative connotations, but in Spanish the idea of the campesino can have a lot of pride, right? Jíbaro has a lot of pride of the connection to the land, and as a rural person who is a steward, right, of a land, or a participant in farm work. So those things can have a lot of like orgullo, a lot of pride, versus in the English way of using that word is can be different. So
yeah, and these are not uncontested terms, because there are racial issues behind it and so on. But I guess to the question of emerging farmers, I think there is a recognition, and it's one of the things that one of the protagonists explains in the movie, is the impact that it had, sort of the Operation Bootstraps in Puerto Rico, and the whole push to turn what was an agrarian society with all its inequality and racism and colonialism, to turn it into an industrial economy, and sort of moving towards the cities. And that movement, it came also with a lot of baggage on how the countryside was valued, and the work of the people who actually produce food, not the landowners, but the people who produce the food. So it's a very, I think it's a story that repeats itself in many places with its particularities, and we're at a moment where people are re-signifying what it means, not only conceptually but in practice.
Elizabeth, I'll add the feeling of it in Minnesota is oftentimes that sometimes it's almost voiced because Minnesota has mostly white farmers, white American farmers, and that as though the communities that live here that are communities of color, that are immigrant communities, don't have long family histories, sometimes in their own generation, of taking care of land or taking care of crops in many ways. And so our climate framework is exploring the narrative of climate migration, where people are moving from rural areas into cities in their home countries and then eventually to the United States. And we need to be countering the narrative where, emerging farmers, maybe that's a good term, maybe, I don't know, but more importantly, countering this narrative where, it's like, oh, we're just discovering farming. I remember a conversation with some farmers in Minnesota who someone told me, oh, we really want to help people of color farm. We need to teach them how to farm. I said, whoa. What are you talking about? Like, we're an immigrant organization where so many people have come directly from farming families in many countries. So, so I love that what Mariolga said about reconnecting that 500 years of history, of telling that this is an agricultural or a farming narrative that is historic for our communities.
I mean, maybe we should be clear with this. The history of agriculture is also a history of exploitation within the long colonial history that we share in this continent. So exploitation of the people who were already there with their own logics on how to relate to land and to producing food, and the people who were brought as slaves. So one of the conversations that we have here is that reclaiming farming also has to be a decolonial move, in the sense that even the definition of what a farmer is the one who holds the land, not necessarily the one who produces food. And so we're using farmer just as the person who is taking care of the land and producing food. We're not making the distinction, and we know it's it's also a way of reclaiming. Just you work with the land, but then the relationship with the land. And I'm not going to say a lot about this because I don't know how much you saw of the film, and we want people to go see it. But at the end of the day, after following these farmers for over 3 years, the relationship and who holds the land became the issue for them. Not the farming practices, but actually being able to hold the land.
We've already talked a lot about this, but I want to dig just a little bit deeper, because this conversation is happening here as well, and also with Indigenous folks here in Minnesota. I had a conversation with, her name's Waziataween. She's a Dakota woman who's bringing back Indigenous food systems and way of caring for the land in this region. And she, this was a couple years ago, but she shared with me that she doesn't really like the word steward. And, the direct translation in Spanish is owner. And to her, that's very, it kind of comes from this Judeo-Christian tradition of man having dominion over the land. And Indigenous cultures in North America, we're all related. All beings are related, and it's much more about interconnection than dominion. So I wanted to hear from you about how you think about that word steward. And language is really imperfect. And tell me how you think about those terms.
Well, I mean, the title of the documentary comes out of the
land reform, the agrarian land reform of 1941.
Yeah, sort of the current La ley de tierras. So the law, I mean,
The law of the land.
I don't know if it translates as the law of the land, but La Ley de Tierras of 1941. That when you read it, it sounds like a sort of a communist manifesto of the 30s, right? And basically, what it was saying is it's close to what the Mexican Revolution was saying, right? The land should be owned by the people who work the land. Not by some foreign or other powerful people who are not tied to that land. And so we literally pull from that part of the law that says the land should be las dueñas de la tierra, the landowners should be the ones who care for the land. Knowing perfectly well that him and I are in a different place. We're actually, as we were finishing the film, we embarked in another major project, which was to
About
after this one. Okay.
yeah 10 years before this movie, we were already organizing in between sustainable farmer organizations conversations about land tenure, because we already saw the problem of access to land and also of that relationship of human beings to land, that thing of ownership or not. And we did have some conversations in Casa Pueblo, which is an organization in the mountains who has been fighting against mining in the mountains of Puerto Rico. Had a very important struggle, and they won. So we had conversations there with many groups of farmers about land tenure. So we've been thinking about this through all our time since we've been related to farming. So 10 years para adelante, while we're filming the movie, Hurricanes Maria and Irma come through Puerto Rico, which have been the worst hurricanes till since we have recorded history. And the disaster capitalism started happening in Puerto Rico. We started seeing people with money doing land grabs around the island. And when you see the movie, you'll see that's related to the movie also, that we saw that our farmers had struggles to stay in the land that we're farming. And so we decided that we had to do something else. And for the last 10 years, we've been trying to find out a transition project as to our relation to the land.
Right. And we see it as transition projects because we recognize we are in a particular relationship with the United States and with a particular legal system. And so those conversations were, okay, so how we can hold land collectively without it being threatened by the market, right? And so those conversations ended in a decision that we make with a group of people of forming the first community land trust, the first agricultural community land trust in Puerto Rico. So it's a transition project, recognizing that what dominates the land is the notion of property, of private property, and that one of the responses within the system that people can make is to pull land outside of that game, right? And to form land commons. Mm-hmm. And so that's the road that we're traveling right now, knowing that it's imperfect, that it requires to carve an imaginary that was totally depleted from us. And that's a different conversation in terms of how much we can pull from what in our indigenous ancestors knew on how to relate to land. In Puerto Rico, there was a major genocide, and we, even though we have their traces, we don't have their points of view. There's no abuela to ask how to manage common lands. I'm saying this as a risk because I'm sure people in Puerto Rico are like, of course, my grandmother. But it's not part of the public discussion. And that's why I was saying democratizing the discussion also means making political things that might be knowledge in a particular community or in a particular family, but it's not part of the public debate and it doesn't become political in that sense. So, with the Fideicomiso de Tierras Comunitarias para la Agricultura Sostenible, we are starting to have that conversation to decommodify land. And this week, we signed the first land donation to the land trust.
Congratulations.
And just to note that, some people might have heard about land trust, but this is a community land trust. And what's different between a conservation land trust and a community land trust is that the people who live on the, geographic, the lands are part of the governance, the people who make the decisions of what's going to happen. That's different about a conservation land trust that, there's a board that who knows, so, they're picked by other forces. And we thought that as if the people who work the land are going to make the decisions, and as a group where everybody is going to be part, of this process, there would be better stewardship, or better taking care of a better relationship to other living beings and to the land that sustains us.
And it also means that the ownership is collective. The ownership is in trust, right? For generations. So we want to have the conversations about securing tenancy without putting at risk the land in the market.
And there's a lot of pressures in Puerto Rico, and I know,
To sell.
and to sell, and I know in the United States also, with the push of building the renewable energy infrastructure on top of farmland, because it's easier for them because it's already flat. They don't have to do anything, but they're destroying the spaces that we need to grow our foods.
Now I've heard that all about the Bitcoin operations and other tech companies, moving to the island, buying land as well for, previously I know it was pharmaceuticals, but different industry that continues to, be this profitable international corporate game. And so I really, admired it. And I'm so excited to hear about stories of excitement and progress, like moving forward on a land trust like that.
Yeah, and we're also struggling with short-term, the logic of the short-term rentals and the visitor economy. So everything is moving towards serving people who come through, Puerto Rico. And so there are, a housing crisis, a land access crisis, and, community land trusts are just one way in which we can carve spaces where they operate under different logics and with a different ethic.
Yeah, and it's very common for the farmers who can or are able to be successfully economically, and I put my fingers up, I don't know how you say that, and quote unquote successful. That they make enough money to buy their land, and they feel that they are protecting the land because they were able to have individual private property rights of the land. And what we're seeing is that even if that maybe could be true, it's the possibility that the second generation or third generation wants to farm is not always the case, right? And we've seen it. We're seeing it all around the world where people, if you go to the college and study something else, everybody's pushing the next generation to study or, be a professional, be a electrician or whatever. So not necessarily that's going to be the choice of the next generation. And then the land is sold to the highest bidder because, the next generation doesn't want to farm. So then there's that question of how do we take care of farmland as a common goods or as a commons? Are we gonna consider the right to eat and the right for food, and then if we have a right to for food, the land, how are we going to consider farming land? Like what's going to be our plan to protect farmland for future generations?
Well, I'm excited for you to be in Minnesota, and I hope we can get there. There are lots of people working on community commons here in our communities, and they all look a little bit different because, well, every community is different, and also state by state, like the laws are different about what land ownership can look like and governance and all of those things. But we're seeing a lot of really interesting models pop up.
There's no one solution or, one, silver, whatever. And I don't even want to finish that sentence, but that phrase, but there's no one solution to very complex problems and systemic, long-standing problems. But we do work from the understanding that we are in transition. We're in the middle of a climate and civilizatory crisis. We're in transition to something else. What that something else is, it's in our hands. It could go either way. And so we are trying to carve basic material conditions for people to stay and to actually grow in relationship with nature and with each other.
That's beautiful. Makes it a little hopeful and a little scary, I think. Big responsibility.
And you touched a really good thing, which was earlier on, you said, people ask you, what should we do for the farmers in Puerto Rico?
Yeah.
And that the call to action is what we can do here. I mean, beyond, working on land access policy, is there other things you would call on, organizations like ours in Minnesota, for example, to be working on in solidarity?
Well, I think that because we are living pretty much the same struggles, in their local manifestations, naming Puerto Rico and farmers in Puerto Rico as one, as part of that struggle, wherever you are, it's a way also of this making visible that we are together in the same fight. And so, talking with other people about it, it's important. There are many people who are, trying to come to return and help here and having these conversations with anybody who is in that movement, physical movement also, about or share struggles is important. I mean, we are in support of the right to self-determination. So making that part of what you claim for Puerto Rico, decisions are being made by people who are not really committed to staying here and working for the common good. I mean, when you see the documentary, these people are just believing what they do, and they just want to be able to do it. And if they are successful, everybody is going to benefit, right? And I think that's part of the conversation we need to have. What farmers and people who work the land and do it sustainably, what they do is in benefit to everybody. Not only because we assert our right to food, but also because the way in which we farm is also the way in which we care for the planet. Yeah, I mean, making sure that people know we're in this together is important.
Mm-hmm. Solidarity. If you are interested in attending a film screening on June 3rd or 4th, see the links on the podcast page for Ear to the Ground, episode 309 at landstewardshipproject.org. The June 3rd screening will take place at the Northfield Community Center in Northfield at 700 Lincoln Parkway from 3 to 7 p.m. And the June 4th screening will take place at the Primero de Mayo Workers Center in Minneapolis at 3521 East Lake Street from 3 to 7 p.m. At each screening, you'll have the opportunity to hear from Reyes Cruz and local beginning farmers about how they want to address the issue of land access and build community to create opportunities moving forward. Dinner will also be provided. If you have comments or suggestions about this podcast, contact Brian DeVore at bdevore@landstewardshipproject.org or 612-816-9342. By the way, it helps us greatly if you can give Ear to the Ground a rating on whatever podcast platform you use. Thanks to Laura Borgendale, a Western Minnesota musician, for Ear to the Ground's theme music. And a special thank you to all of Land Stewardship Project's members who make initiatives such as this podcast possible. If you're not a member, visit landstewardshipproject.org to learn how you can support LSP. Thanks for listening.